What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 290 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I want to talk to you about JLA World War III. This collects issues 34 through 41 of the JLA series from the late 90s, early 2000s. This is the last volume of Grant Morrison's ongoing run on the Justice League series. And this is possibly the biggest, most epic superhero story that I've ever read. There are other stories like Crisis on Infinite Earths that might match this, but I feel like per square inch, this has more bang for your buck than any other superhero comic that I can think of. Crisis definitely had longer reaching effects across the DC universe, but it was also about twice as long as this. And when you consider that one of the issues in this book isn't actually part of the World War III storyline, really it's even more bang for your buck than what you would initially think. One of the issues here is a fill-in issue written by J.M. DeMatteis, and it is kind of a quiet issue comparatively speaking, where we get to see the aftermath of Hal Jordan being merged with the Spectra, and we get to see him getting schooled on what it means to be the Spectra by the members of the Justice League. That happens, that's the second issue in this book, and I will go ahead and say, up until now, I haven't really minded any of the fill-in issues in this run because most of them have been pretty good, and they have been strategically placed at good points in the run. For example, Morrison might finish doing a 3-issue arc, and then maybe he needs a little bit of time to work on his next arc, or the artist working with him needs a little bit of time, and so you'll have a 2-issue Mark Millar tie-in, or a 2-issue Mark Waid tie-in, or something like that, in between arcs that Grant Morrison is working on. This one is just a tiny bit problematic because it happens smack dab in between issues of this arc. You have part 1 of World War III, and then you have this story about the Spectre that doesn't have anything to do with World War III, and then we get back to the World War III storyline. It's not a big problem, but it is a little bit irksome whenever you're reading this all together like this. Also, what's a little strange here, at the tail end of DC 1 Million, Martian Manhunter briefly went on sabbatical away from the team to kind of emotionally recover after the destruction of Montevideo or Mount Video. I still don't know how to pronounce that. It's a real place in South America, I believe, and it had a very big part of Martian Manhunter's life, and he wanted to take a little bit of time away from the Justice League. And then a little bit into this, a little less than halfway into the World War III storyline, Jean comes back in and he says, "Hey guys, I'm back. I'm ready to resume active duty in the Justice League." And it's a pretty big moment. It's one of those end-of-the-issue zingers, except that it loses a little bit of its punch because in every single one of these fill-in issues that we've seen from Millar or Mark Waid or J.M. DeMatteis, Martian Manhunter is there, part of the League, doing stuff. So it loses a little bit of that oomph whenever we've seen Jean with the League in all of these fill-in issues. Someone in editorial should have told all of these fill-in guys, hey, Martian Manhunter is not part of the League whenever you're doing this story. So unless they said something like, hey, this takes place right before DC 1 Million, then they really shouldn't have had Martian Manhunter being there. So that's another little thing that's a little bit irksome, but again, not a huge detriment to this story. I said that this is one of the most epic things that I've ever read. This is a really apt conclusion to Morrison's JLA. Up until now, each of the arcs, more or less, have felt like they were kind of their own thing. There's a little bit of continuity thrown in throughout. For example, whenever Green Arrow leaves the Justice League, later Batman tells Huntress that she's there to replace Green Arrow. So we have just a little bit of continuity here and there. Early on in the series, Superman is talking about expanding the ranks, and that's something that continued throughout the series, but more or less, you could read each of these volumes out of order. In fact, that's what I did whenever I was first reading this series when I was in high school. But this volume, in a lot of ways, it is tying threads from all of the other volumes together. We have another attempt by Lex Luthor to destroy the Justice League with a second version of the Injustice Gang that kind of follows up on some of the events of Rock of Ages. We also have Prometheus. He is part of that Injustice Gang, and I don't remember which volume Prometheus showed up in, but he's here once again. General Eiling, he showed up in the previous volume. He's back once again. There is another member of this Injustice Gang. Her name is Queen Bee. I have never read anything from her. I had to Google her. Apparently she is a Silver Age JLA villain, and she's here. I do wish that Morrison could have done something with her before bringing her into this modern version of the League, because as is, this feels like a greatest hits album from all of Grant Morrison's enemies that he's used in his JLA run, and then you have this character Queen Bee that I've never heard of before, and was was not in any way part of Morrison's League, or his JLA run. So that was a little weird, but these guys are really just the pre-show, if you will. They are not the main villains of the book, but they also are taking up quite a bit of time of the League, especially in the first half of the book. The rest of the book is a big bad guy called Mageddon, or Mageddon. I'm assuming it's pronounced Mageddon, as in Armageddon, and I got Mageddon confused with Solaris. Several reviews ago, I mentioned that I think it would have been cool if we could see Mageddon show up again in later stories after Morrison left the Justice League. I was actually thinking of Solaris, who was the bad guy from DC 1 Million. Mageddon is a much bigger threat. In fact, we see him in like one page in his full glory. Other than that, we're really only seeing the effects of Mageddon. We're not actually seeing the superheroes go and punch a bad guy. It's much bigger than that. And we find out that most of the characters in this series have been gearing themselves up to fight Mageddon in one way or another. We find out that Zariel actually joined the Justice League and left Heaven specifically to fight Mageddon, who is an old god. And in fact, the Fourth World characters who are part of the team, Big Barda and Orion, we find out that they joined the Justice League specifically to help them fight against Mageddon. And they are talking about how Mageddon is a precursor to the Fourth World, how he is an old god, and I don't know if he's from the Third World or from the Second World. I don't know, because around this time there was a crossover story called Genesis. I'm thinking that John Byrne was involved with that story. I'm not sure, but in that series, I believe it was said that the Third World was the mythos of like Greek mythology and stuff like that. That they were the Third World, and then characters like Orion and Darkseid, they are from the Fourth World. So Mageddon, I don't know which pantheon he's from. They just call him an old god. But anyway, we find out that all of those guys, the only reason that they actually joined the Justice League was in preparation of this big world-ending threat. In fact, at one point, they even reference Justice League Midsummer Nightmare, which was a story that came out shortly before Morrison's Justice League run started, and that was written by Mark Waid. Apparently, that was kind of something that was referencing this, which is kind of interesting that Waid and Morrison were still working in tandem even at that point. We find out around this time, Morrison and Waid were actually wanting to do not All-Star Superman. They were wanting to do a Superman revival / revamp called Superman 2000, I think, and they were wanting to do that with Mark Millar and Tom Pyre. And so it's kind of cool that even though the Superman 2000 thing didn't take off, that we were getting to see them work together a little bit on Justice League around this time. We got to see Waid do a fill-in story, and then after Morrison's run ends, we get to see Waid pick up the reins and take the Justice League in his own direction. So it's kind of cool that apparently Mark Waid was setting up the big ultimate threat of Morrison's Justice League in his own Justice League miniseries. But I do think that it's a little disappointing that, spoilers, they do defeat Mageddon, but that's not what's disappointing. I do find it a little disappointing that after they defeat Mageddon, Zariel, Barda, and Orion, they leave the Justice League. Apparently it's like, well, this is what we came here to defeat. Now that we've done it, you guys don't need us anymore. I kind of liked that Morrison had expanded the ranks of the Justice League so that it was more than just the Big Seven. I like seeing the Big Seven work together, but occasionally I like seeing some of the lesser-known characters be in the Justice League also. One of my other favorite runs of the Justice League is the 1980s Justice League International run, which had almost exclusively C-list characters. So I really like the innovation of adding characters like Oracle, Steel, Plastic Man, Zariel. I really like adding those characters to this run, and I was a little disappointed to see most of those characters leave the League after the defeat of Mageddon. I'm pretty sure the only one who actually stays on the team after Morrison leaves is Plastic Man, and that's a little disappointing. I'm not sure if Mark Waid asked Morrison to get rid of all these guys, because before now, we weren't really under the impression that Zariel had a specific mission on Earth. It was kind of hinted that the reason he left Earth was because he had a crush on this woman. We find that out in the American Dreams volume, although I don't remember anything coming of that after he met that woman. But we never heard anything about him coming to Earth specifically to fight this giant god who's going to end the universe. So it's a little disappointing that after this, Zariel doesn't really do anything in the DC universe. He showed up a little bit in the Justice Society series to talk to Hawkgirl a little bit, and then he showed up in 52, which was co-written by Grant Morrison. So it's once again Grant Morrison bringing back characters that he introduced, and then nobody else being interested in using those characters. I would have liked to have seen Zariel stay on the League, if anything. Barda and Orion, they could have left or stayed. It really wouldn't have mattered to me. I would have liked to have seen Zariel stay on. And Steel, I really like seeing Steel be part of the League, although after he left, at least he stuck around the DC Universe and other people used him. But Zariel just kind of vanished, and that was a little bit disappointing. And like I said, I'm thinking maybe Mark Waid said, hey, can you kind of rein it in a little bit before I come on the book so that it can just be the main Justice League guys. That's a little disappointing, but when the run has been this solid, I can't really complain that much, although I do wish we could have seen more of those guys in later Justice League books. Another thing that Morrison does in defeating the ultimate bad guy, I don't want to spoil too much of how he does it, but he kind of does this thing again in his new X-Men run. There's a thing where Jean Grey is able to tap into every mind on the planet in order to defeat the bad guy in the new X-Men Imperial storyline, and it's very similar to how he defeats Mageddon in the finale of his JLA run. But I actually think that the way Mageddon is defeated here is a little bit more interesting than how Cassandra Nova was defeated in the new X-Men story Imperial. Although it does kind of feel like when you go and read his new X-Men story that came just a few years after this, it does feel like he's kind of retreading the same water just a little bit. Although reading this, you wouldn't necessarily know that because this came before new X-Men. Overall, I really like this book quite a bit. I have very few complaints. Really, my only complaints are how he kind of gets rid of the characters that he brought into the League about halfway through the series, and overall, that's not a big deal breaker or anything like that. But I really like this book quite a bit. Overall, I really enjoy Grant Morrison's Justice League. I think this is a high point for the series overall. I don't think that anyone who came after Morrison has really reached the levels that the series was at while he was on the book. I read a few of the runs that came afterwards, all the way up to Infinite Crisis, I think, and I was kind of disappointed in most of those runs. I did like the Mark Waid stuff quite a bit, but for the most part, I think that Morrison really took this series in a place that nobody else has been able to get since then, and that's a little disappointing since that means for the last 15 years I haven't enjoyed the Justice League like I did when I was reading this stuff. And part of it is nostalgia because I discovered this series when I was in high school around the same time when I was getting into the Justice League cartoon, but reading this series now, I'm finding it's not nostalgia because this series holds up just as good now as it did when I was in high school. So if you've never read this series, I highly, highly recommend that you go through and read all the volumes that I've talked about over the last week or so, and do yourself a favor and just sit down and enjoy them. You will not be disappointed. At least, I don't think you will. So those are my thoughts on World War III. I hope that you guys liked this video, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow with a different video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.